Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for coming here to the IISS today on this very blustery Friday afternoon. My name is Joseph Dempsey. I'm a research associate here in the Institute, and it's great to see such a full room today, but it's perhaps no surprise given our speaker. Benjamin Wittes is a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institute. He's also the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Lawfare, a blog dedicated to discussion of hard national security choices, and has written extensively on the subjects of national security and law. We are delighted to have him here today to discuss a very interesting subject, President Trump's domestic problems and the impact they may be having on US power abroad. Benjamin will talk for about 25 to 30 minutes on the subject, and then we'll have the opportunity to ask any questions of him. So without further ado, Benjamin, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me. I want to start with an apology. My voice is almost entirely gone, as you can hear, and I may start coughing at any time. This has disadvantages and advantages. The chief disadvantage is obvious. The chief advantage is that I will talk less and not engage in my usual verbosity, and I'll probably save a little bit more time for questions, and then encourage you all to be as verbose as possible in formulating the question. So the subject that I wanted to talk about is the impact of the president's legal problems domestically on the U.S. as a foreign policy actor is, as I was trying to formulate thoughts, is actually a complex issue because disaggregating the various things that are affecting the U.S. as a foreign policy actor right now and conditioning it are rather difficult. So one of those things, as I will try to describe, is the complex list of legal problems that the president is having. But that list really does bleed into a whole series of other issues that it's actually can be difficult to tell which is the foreground and which is the background condition. So one of them is the president's general political weakness. This is a president who was elected with a minority of the vote, of the national popular vote, which is a peculiarity of the U.S. political system, that is not only still possible, but it does still happen on, not often, but it has happened twice in this decade, including in 2016. And the president didn't just lose the electoral vote, he lost it rather handily. The popular vote. He lost it rather handily, and he barely scraped by with what actually one of the purposes of the Electoral College in the United States is that it magnifies the amplitude of a victory, and it definitely served that function for Donald Trump, but that fact masks that he's actually a rather weak actor politically, including being unpopular the day he was elected and unpopular every day since, up to and including the present day. His poll numbers sort of range between 36 and 42%, but they're never higher than that, at least in the poll averages. And so this is the baseline condition that I'm speaking against is a politician who is not broad, didn't have that big a base to begin with and has not broadened it. The second factor, there's no polite way to say this, so I'm going to say it rudely. There are some other underlying disorganization conditions in the president's administration, starting with his own mind. This is an individual who is not an organized thinker, is not a particularly organized actor, and has run a shockingly disorganized administration. And so as you're thinking about the impact of the Mueller investigation, it can be hard to figure out what part of it is Mueller investigation and what part of it is the disorganization of the individual's thinking, or just the disorganization of what is a genuinely chaotic administration. related but important enough to be discussed distinctly aspect of that is that this is a person who has a strong propensity to see conspiracy theories under every bush and to tweet about them. And so to what extent he is, when he, for example, tweets about the Mueller investigation or tweets about his legal problems, to what extent that reflects a kind of particular anxiety or difficulty about that, and to what extent it simply reflects that he impulsively tweets about everything can also be difficult to disentangle. So with those as preemptive caveats, let me say that I do think it is having a significant effect. And I'm going to try to lay out what I think some of the components of that effect look like. I'm going to start by giving you a kind of update on the assumption that and it may be depending on how conversant y'all are in sort of domestic American investigative matters. That may be a matter of review for a lot of you, but I'll start there, try to isolate the specific effects, and then talk a little bit about why I think those effects are likely to get significantly worse over the next couple of months and certainly over the couple of years that are going to follow the midterm elections. All right, so update on the president's legal woes. These are diverse and multifaceted, and each component that I'm going to name here has elements that could itself, there are rabbit holes we could easily go down, where I'm happy to go down any or all of those rabbit holes in the Q&A. But for now, here's a basic overview. I think it is fair to say there are three major components, maybe four major components of the legal problems that the president is having, as distinct from the political problems or the policy criticisms. And they are in no particular order. The first is the core Mueller investigation examination of Russian intervention in the 2016 election and alleged or hypothesized collusion or collaboration, coordination between people on the U.S. side of the Atlantic and that Russian operation. So this is by far, I think, the most significant matter from an international perspective. It may not be the most significant matter from a domestic impact perspective, but it is important internationally, as I'll describe, both because the president is thinking about it all the time in connection with his interactions with Russia, and also because it is the component of the investigation that has the most ongoing overt international implications. So Bob Mueller has indicted not merely a set of Russian intelligence officers, GRU officers, for the underlying hacks of Democratic and Clinton-affiliated emails, but also a series of Russian actors in connection with the social media campaign through which disparaging information was distributed, not the email hacks, but the sort of a broader social media campaign run by the Internet Research Agency. And so one of the big questions that is currently overhanging the U.S. political system is, does Bob Mueller bring that set of criminal allegations back onto the U.S. side of the Atlantic, right? Is the next set of indictments, assuming there is one, going to be a set for people in the U.S., maybe affiliated in some sense with the campaign, maybe not, for active involvement or passive involvement or whatever with those sets of operations. The second area, and this has, I think, no international valence, but it is perhaps the most significant from the U.S. Domestic perspective, is the investigation of obstruction of justice. The reason, this is unlike the collusion investigation. This material does not involve alleged international action. It simply involves the way the president has engaged with the investigation itself. The most overt act of which was firing the FBI director, but there's a whole series of other things that he's done, some of which are public, and everybody assumes there's an additional set that are not yet public that raise questions under the obstruction of justice statutes. And I think the reason, for international purposes, the reason this investigation is particularly significant is not that the activity implicates U.S. international power, but that the response might, which is to say that this is the area that could most plausibly, I think, lead in the shorter medium term to an impeachment inquiry, particularly, as I'll discuss, if Republicans no longer control the House in the next month or so. And that is a potentially debilitating problem for a president in his capacity as president, irrespective of what the nature of the allegations are. The third area, which I don't know if there has been a lot of discussion of it in the UK, but it's certainly raised a lot of eyebrows at home, is the Michael Cohen investigation, which you might know better as the Stormy Daniels investigation. And this is a purely domestic issue. It does not, it does not raise any issues in and of itself. It is an enormous wild card, however. This investigation has been spun off the Mueller investigation. It has led to Michael Cohen, in the context of pleading guilty to felonies, implicating the president in felonies. And unlike the Mueller investigation, it is not obvious how the president could fire his way out of this particular problem because of the structure of the offices that are running the investigation. I'm happy to talk about that more. So the result is that I think you have there is an additional investigation that's probably worth thinking about, or at least keeping in the back of your mind, which is that the New York Times did a major story a week and a half ago that was almost totally lost in the Brett Kavanaugh stuff, but it was a 30-year history of Donald Trump's taxes and ending actually a fair bit ago, but this has spawned probably a bunch of at least New York level investigations. There are some related New York State investigations of things like the president's foundation, the Trump Foundation, and so sort of think of a background condition of all of this being the president's money being a subject of various regulatory interests. Okay, so what is so I think it is reasonable to hypothesize that all of this is having a number of impacts. And as I was coming over here, I was trying to think about, like, what is the actual evidence of that? And I want to posit a few areas of impact and a few areas where there's actually sort of evidence of impact. So the first evidence of impact that this is really conditioning the way the president behaves is that he says so. And one of the things about Donald Trump that is genuinely different from all other presidents and almost all other leaders of countries is that we have this ongoing intel feed into what he thinks, which is his Twitter feed and his own sort of logorrheal incapacity to shut up. And so he's told us this on a number of occasions, that he's really thinking about this a lot. So if you look at his Twitter feed, he will often, most famously tweet about the witch hunt and the 17 angry Democrats and all these sort of pejorative things. But one of the things that he says on a periodic basis is that the investigation is embarrassing him internationally. And he doesn't, he usually uses the words embarrassment or disgrace not to reflect his own reaction to it, but what he thinks our national psychodrama should be about it. I don't think it is an unreasonable way to understand those comments as reflecting a certain degree of personal mortification at having to talk to foreign leaders with this hanging over his head. Privately, on a number of occasions, he has said exactly that. If you look at Jim Comey's account of his why the president wanted a public statement that he was not under investigation, this was a component of it, that he found it humiliating to have to go out and interact with people internationally with this hanging over his head. Bob Woodward's recent book, Fear, describes him getting off the phone or telling his lawyer that he had been on the phone with General Sisi and was embarrassed and mortified that General Sisi had apparently said something. We don't know if Trump made this up or if Sisi really said it, of course, but this is Trump's account of it, that General Sisi had said that he didn't really know if Trump was going to be around in a few months, and that he found that a very difficult environment in which to operate. And so I think the first reason to Trump is dishonest about a great many things. I've never known him to be dishonest about his own emotional state. He's actually incapable of hiding his emotional state. And I think the first and most important piece of evidence that this is actually bothering him internationally is that he says it in a lot of different ways. There is also some visible evidence of its constraining him specifically with respect to his interactions with Russia. And these interactions, these cut in somewhat different directions. They're sort of, I guess, a shot from the left and a shot from the right. But the evidence of visible constraint is that the president came in badly wanting to have a warm relationship with Vladimir Putin, badly wanting to improve relations with Russia, and he has not been able to do that. And in fact, the Congress, which has been notably lackluster about pushing back on all things related to Trump's excesses, Russia is an enormous exception. It's in fact the principal exception is the sanctions bill that was passed over Trump's objections. He did not feel he could veto it, so he signed it, and has been grumbling about it since. And so I think in an environment in which the president really wants to, as he puts it, get along with Russia, he is actually in a position in which the the nature, in part, the nature of the allegations against him vis-a-vis this set of things actually meaningfully prevents the precise warming of relations that he wants. So that's, now I'm going to completely contradict myself from the other side. The other side is that the president chafes against that. He really doesn't like it. And so when he chafes against that, he goes into these sort of demonstrative mode of talking about and these sort of shows of warmth and indignation at the way he is constrained. And the most visible example of that is Helsinki, right, where he, behaved in a way that shocked, I would say, probably 2/3 of the United States and 90% of the rest of the world, in these kinds of shows of warmth with Putin. And I think the best way to understand this is that he is, in fact, constrained in the way I just described, very frustrated by those constraints, and so takes opportunities to push back against the shackles that he has on himself or perceives on himself, and I think correctly perceives on himself. And the result are these sort of very inappropriate displays of affection and comedy and normalcy, as well as criticisms, some of them quite overt. If you go back to the text of what he said at Helsinki, the chafing at these constraints really drips off of his remarks. Finally, this is not, I want to say this very tentatively, and I don't want to overstate this, but I do think there is at least some evidence that we may be seeing damage to U.S. intelligence sharing relationships. And let me say that to all of our intelligence partners who are concerned and think that there are risks that they didn't used to take into account about intel sharing with the United States, I would say that's correct. I'm not discouraging intel sharing with the United States, but it's certainly, it is a remarkable thing for the United States president to have shared information apparently about an ally's intelligence program in the Oval Office with the Russians. That's not something that we typically do, and similarly, and perhaps more disturbingly, honestly, the aggressive manner in which the president's allies in Congress, particularly Devin Nunes, but some of the others as well, the House Intelligence Committee chairman, have gone after sources and methods in an effort to discredit the Russia investigation, I think could not but have sent a very powerful message to, for example, the Australians, who seem to have provided the intelligence that began the investigation to begin with. And so I think we do have to at least worry about the message that is being not merely sent, because that is that message is on a it's being sent with a very loud volume, but being received. And I do think, to the extent that U.S. intel partners are thinking about what are the circumstances in which we maximize our own interests in interactions with U.S. intel, that is not an unreasonable set of questions for people to be thinking about. And one of the projects that I think any subsequent Congress and any subsequent administration is going to have to give some serious thought to is to how to repair those relationships and reassure partners that the United States is actually a reliable intelligence partner. All right, so if that's pretty bleak, let me make it worse, because I actually think it's going to get worse. I think it's going to get worse along the way to getting better. I do think this is an aberration, and it's one that we need to work through. We will work through. We've gone through truly crazy periods of American politics before, American legal history. Unlike a lot of countries, we tend to wear that stuff on our sleeves and kind of let it all hang out, and that's what we're doing. I do think, very much hope, it's a temporary state of affairs, but I do think the climax that it builds to and the denouement from that climax are going to be very, very ugly. So here are a number of reasons to think it's going to get worse. The first is that, the president is very likely to get shellacked in the coming midterm elections. And that's not definite by any means. He was very likely to lose 2 years ago, and he won. So, you should take that with a grain of salt. But the likelihood that the Republicans retain control of the House of Representatives seems pretty small right now. The House is relatively closely divided as it is. The Democrats need to pick up 23 seats in order to gain. Right now, most projections have them picking up 30-plus seats. So I think that if you had to bet now, you would easily take even odds that the Democrats gain control of the House. Now, you all know this, but we're not a parliamentary system, and so when the president gets shellacked in the midterm elections, it doesn't mean the government falls. What it means is we have a war. Because we have, in American separation of powers, the House is an independent actor of the Senate, and both are independent of the president. And the House can do what it wants. I assume the Senate will not flip hands, by the way. But if the House were to flip hands, the House has certain independent responsibilities and authorities, including the ability to investigate all the things that it has not spent the last 2 years investigating. It also has the ability to curtail the investigations of the set of things that the House has been investigating, specifically the Chris Steele dossier and the origins of the Mueller investigation, which is the source of a lot of the pressures to disclose sources in the context of the current House. That will go away, but what will not go away, what will replace it, is a very aggressive set of investigations of the president. And while I personally think that is a very important thing that absolutely needs to happen, if you think the president is distracted and rocked back on his heels now by this stuff, add to the Mueller investigation, add to the Southern District of New York, 3 House committees investigating different aspects all the time, and a kind of the House going from a wall of defense for the president to a wall of offense, that will be a very disruptive thing. Number 2, Bob Mueller isn't done. Now, what that means, I don't know. It could mean that he's not done, but he will be in a few months, and the thing quietly peters out. I suspect it does not mean that. And I suspect we are in a lull in the run-up to the election, and there's going to be further action on both the obstruction front, which I'll come to in a minute, and on the sort of collusion, Russian interference front. I can, in the Q&A, we can talk about the sort of particular valences that are available there, but there's some serious outstanding questions. And on the obstruction front in particular, according to a lot of press reports, seem to have their roots in the president's lawyers. Mueller is writing some kind of an obstruction report. If you imagine these things coming to a head in the context of Democratic control over the House of Representatives, that is a very potentially explosive situation. Number 3, the Michael Cohen thing isn't going away. Again, it could peter out. It could be that Southern District of New York which is kind of the elite, one of the true elite federal prosecution offices in the United States. It could be that they have a case against Michael Cohen and they don't have a case even with his cooperation against anybody else. I don't think a lot of people believe that. And so I think you have to imagine a series of investigative matters all coming to fruition or coming to a head or coming to whatever they're going to come to in the context of depending on when, it'll be in the context of a presidential campaign, because the presidential campaign is going to start the day after the midterm elections. And in the context, likely, of Democratic control over the House. That is a really explosive potential mixture. The result of which is that a protracted impeachment battle is not by any means beyond the realm of possibility. That doesn't mean that Donald Trump is likely to get impeached. But the vocabulary of American politics for the next 2 years may well be a question of impeachment. And to go back to my original background conditions, this is not a person who, like Bill Clinton, is capable of what Bill Clinton used to call compartmentalization. This is somebody who gets consumed with things, right? And Clinton, whatever one says about him, and I assure you my enthusiasm is altogether under control, had a remarkable ability to bracket the fact that he was the first president since Andrew Johnson in 1868 to be impeached and to face trial in the Senate. He actually managed somehow to have that in one part of his brain and deal with that in one part of his brain, and in the other parts of his brain to function as president. I think there's a genuine question as to whether Donald Trump is sort of emotionally, intellectually, and from a staffing point of view capable of that. And one last reason why it's going to get worse, because the adults are leaving the room. And, we used to have what we called the axis of adults, which was always a bit of a misnomer because some of the adults were really more like adolescents than true adults, but they at least weren't crazy children. And so this week, Nikki Haley resigned. We're still not quite sure why. Nikki Haley is not somebody who 3 years ago I would have described as an adult. She was somebody with, like, a governor of a small state, right? I'm not really sure what the analog to that is in the UK. I mean, she had no foreign policy experience whatsoever. She just functioned as an adult. She's what passes for an adult in this administration. We're very likely to lose Jim Mattis, who is a real adult, an actual adult. And we have replaced H.R. McMaster with John Bolton, which is, from my point of view, not a good trade. And so when you look at the landscape and you say, what is the level at which, when all of this stuff happens, what is the quality of staffing that the president will have at both the agency level and at the White House staff level? The answer is that it was never good, and it's getting worse. And so on that cheerful note, I will stop, and I'm happy to take your questions. It's the best I can, and my voice actually held out. So,
thank you very much, Benjamin, and thank you very much for navigating us through the quite a numerous domestic problems that face Trump, as you can see, and the implications it could be having in US abroad. I think particularly interesting for me was describing his inability to compartmentalize all these issues, and how you evidence that they are indeed distracting his views and ability to do his job. I think I'm particularly interested as well as whilst it constrains him in his actions, the occasion where he does, so we say, lash out, for a better term, against those is very interesting, and it's very interesting to see your analysis of that. Before I open up to questions, can I ask anyone who wants a question to raise their hand and get my attention? It's good I already have some people. When I pick you, if you could please state your name as well as any affiliation, that'd be great. Okay. Sorry, gentleman there.
I'm Dan Rosenhack. I'm a reporter with The Economist magazine.
So in the United States, the Economist reporters all have British accents, and here you have the U.S. I'm experiencing cognitive dissonance.
Revolving door around the Atlantic. Two related questions about the potential impact of the Democratic House takeover on the investigations. There's tons of speculation about either Sessions or Rosenstein or both exiting after the midterms and the installation of a new Attorney General who would not be recused and thus could take control of the Mueller investigation. What does taking control mean exactly? How much would a Trump lackey in that position be able to constrain the investigation? What could Mueller do, or leaguers within or around his organization do to get the word out if he is constrained? And then finally, how much power would the Democratic committees in a Democratic House have to sort of fill the void and continue those kind of investigations, given what I understand is the somewhat limited power of congressional subpoenas relative to prosecutorial ones?
All right, so the last question is an easy one, which is there is no sense in which a congressional committee can substitute for a full-scale criminal investigation, and the reason is not the reach of the subpoenas or the force of the subpoenas, though that is an issue as well. It's that a congressional committee can't threaten to send you to prison. And the most significant power that the executive branch has is the threat to prosecute people, and that's what compels cooperation much more than subpoenas. In addition, there is an immense resource differential between what any congressional committee under any circumstances is capable of devoting to an investigation and what the FBI is capable of devoting to an investigation. And between those two factors, there is no sense in which a congressional investigation can substitute for what Bob Mueller is doing. That said, so the answer to your first question is much more complicated. And actually, I can refer you to a piece that Susan Hennessy and I wrote about exactly this in relation to the last time the president was contemplating firing Rod Rosenstein. But we laid out what the specific powers that the AG or acting attorney general has with respect to the special counsel. Look, to boil it down, at the margins, they can fire him. That is a power available to them. I don't think it's a functionally available power, but it's a theoretically available power. The power to fire is also at some level the power to supervise. There is a general requirement, in addition, that Mueller consult the acting attorney general on major investigative steps. And Mueller and Rosenstein clearly have a good working relationship that has not become a means of micromanaging or impeding. But you could imagine that being so under a lackey attorney general. So two more points on that. One is that that Mueller has an enormous tool at his disposal to resist that encroachment. And it's a tool that he has so assiduously not used that we don't remember that he has it. But that's the ability to speak, right? So Mueller has cultivated this sense and air of mystery about himself by literally not saying a word during the entire investigation. That could change when Nixon fired Archibald, or had Archibald Cox fired. The turning point in that episode was that Archibald Cox held a press conference, and he talked about it, right? And the power of Archibald Cox's speaking is what made the Saturday Night Massacre in 1973 like a thing that blew back against Nixon rather than, or 1974, worked to his favor. Mueller has kept that card in his vest. If he needs to take it out, he will. And I think it's amazing. One thing that's really interesting is most people don't even know what the sound of his voice is like, right? That will be a big day, the day Bob Mueller gets behind a podium and says, my investigation is being impeded by the Justice Department. That is a game-changing conversation. The other pushback that he has is, when he writes a report, if people in Congress, including particularly in a Congress run by Democrats, think that report is not being shared with them and needs to be, it is very hard to imagine how over time they will not be briefed on the contents of that report or see the report itself. And so, I do think there are ways that a lackey attorney general could be a problem for this investigation. I think people are also underestimating the tools that the investigation has by way of pushing back. One final thought about that. There is one really important tool that Congress has, which is that anybody who replaces Rod Rosenstein or Jeff Sessions, at least in the longer term, has to go through Senate confirmation. And if you study the Saturday Night Massacre, it's a really interesting thing. The reason that neither Elliot Richardson nor Ruckelshaus would fire Archibald Cox was not that they considered it immoral or inappropriate to do so. In fact, they both asked Robert Bork to follow the president's order and fire the special prosecutor. The president was entitled to fire him, just like Jim Comey said, the president is entitled to fire me for any reason or no reason at all, right? The reason they wouldn't do it is that they had said to the Senate Judiciary Committee under oath in their confirmation hearings, they had given commitments to protect the work of the special prosecutor. And they didn't feel that they could do it consistent with their testimony and the oath that they had sworn to tell the truth in that testimony. And I do think that moment where you nominate somebody and that person goes before that committee and gets asked by 100 different ways by 15 different people, do we have your commitment that Bob Mueller will be able to do his work? And you say, yes, you have my commitment. That becomes a very, very hard thing to then behave like a total lackey in the face of.
I think you were first, gentlemen, on the second row.
Vivek Zaz, I'm a postgraduate student of War Studies at King's College. Question is, given what you've been saying, it looks like the pressure will be building up on the president for the next month, especially 2 years. Usually we see the when a leader is domestically contested or challenged. In foreign affairs, it tends to be more assertive, more aggressive. Should we expect to see that in the States too, especially when it comes to, let's say, potential renegotiation of the JCPOA, after the second packet of sanctions in November, or China? Should we expect to see a more aggressive Trump that took over all these domestic topics?
So, Trump has a number of instincts in that regard that are, I don't know what the answer to that question, and it's certainly plausible that the answer is yes. On the other hand, Trump has relatively few firm beliefs. One of them is that he hates foreigners, and he doesn't want to trade with people. Like that, he's pretty consistent about that over a long period of time. Another one is that he is pretty reticent about the use of force. He likes to bluster, but he's not, and he's been, but he actually made what distinguished him, one of the things that distinguished him from other Republicans was his dismissal of George W. Bush and the entire sort of Bush legacy, which the Republican Party up until then had been relatively defensive of. And so if he were to suddenly find that sort of distraction by aggressiveness abroad, particularly in a military sense, was a useful tactic for him, it would be quite a divergence from, who he has been politically over a long period of time. That's not to say that he wouldn't do it. He's highly impulsive and his beliefs are not deep. So I'm not at all suggesting that it couldn't happen. I do think there are reasons latent in his personality as displayed so far to suspect that trade might be might be the place that he'd be sort of more apt to lash out, and that, sustained military action is not something that attracts him particularly. He loves selling weapons. He loves saying I'm making the U.S. military strong, right? Increasing, but actually doing things is not really his thing.
I think gentleman in the back row.
Thank you. When we came from the School of Economics, you mentioned those in the room. There was an op-ed on the New York Times a few weeks ago, claimed to be from a senior official in the White House. Do you think that was a deliberate move from them, or how do you assess it?
So, the op-ed, first of all, the Times would not misrepresent who the author of an op-ed was. So, the relevant question is not whether somebody who is plausibly described as a senior administration official. It's senior administration official, by the way, not senior White House official. It's not whether somebody who's plausibly described that way wrote the piece. That I'm certain of. It's how broadly you have to interpret the word senior in order for the description to be accurate. And senior administration official in the U.S. context is a bit of a term of art in journalism. The trouble is it's a term of art that different journalists use to mean slightly different things. Everybody has a very precise sense of what it means, but they're not always congruent. And so one possibility is that the senior administration official isn't all that senior, just senior enough to be described by that. If you define senior administration official as narrowly as possible, the list of people who could have written that op-ed is quite short. If you define it as broadly as possible, it's hundreds of people. So I think the universe of possibility has to be thought of as the hundreds. And I'll say two things about that op-ed. One is there is nothing in that op-ed that isn't described at great length in Woodward's book. If you doubt the truth of the factual claims in the op-ed about the way the administration engages the presidency, the president, just read Woodward's book. I mean, it's a 300-page or whatever it is elucidation of the factual underpinnings of that op-ed as played out in 8 or 10 different policy areas over the first couple of years of the administration. And there's, simply no doubt in my mind that the factual claims of that op-ed are true. Secondly, that op-ed is unthinkable in any prior U.S. administration, Democrat or Republican, and represents a significant erosion of the respect that the president has traditionally expected from staff and should expect from staff, and the fact that it is that the Trump administration was capable of producing it and the Woodward book within a week of each other is a reflection of the disrepute that Donald Trump has brought the presidency into, including in the eyes of its own staff.
And gentlemen, second one, then we'll follow in the photo behind you.
My name is Angus, I'm a student at LSE. Do you think that the Trump administration is a blip, or has a Rubicon been crossed in how the executive branch is viewed, how it actually is within American politics and ultimately American history?
Yes, I think it is a blip, and it is a Rubicon that has been crossed. And so one of the problems with blips, right, I mean, lots of things are blips, but they show that things that we didn't used to think are possible are actually possible, right? Think about, first of all, you can't entirely answer the either-or question until you know whether Trump gets reelected. Because there's actually only one metric. You know, the U.S. is a winner-take-all system. The presidency, that is. And so it's not like, you know, if the president, Barack Obama, Democrats lost control of both houses of Congress under Barack Obama. They lost most state houses. State governments in the United States really, really matter. And Republicans control most of them today. That all happened under Barack Obama. And yet Barack Obama is thought of as a successful president because he got reelected, right? And if Donald Trump gets reelected, then the tweets work, right? Then what he will have shown is that is that you can have this highly emotive, highly impulsive presidency, and you maintain control of your base, you maintain the support of your base, you fight off the enemy being the 55% majority that loathes you. You fight off legal problems. You don't get a whole lot done, but that's okay, because you get reelected. And that will be a lesson that politicians of the left and right will remember. Now, if Donald Trump doesn't get reelected, then you're much more in blip land. And then the question, but I don't think blips are unimportant, because there are things that you can learn from a blip. For example, prior to Donald Trump, I know of one head of state who personally manned his own Twitter feed. Nobody thinks of it in connection with the Trump Twitter feed because Toomas Ilves of Estonia is a highly responsible, very thoughtful guy, and used his Twitter feed in a fashion that was exemplary and commendable. And a bunch of us thought, wow, isn't it neat that a president is using a Twitter feed, right? Like, and he's personally using it, and if you tweet something at him, he'll answer you. How cool is that? Like, if Donald Trump is not reelected, that does not mean, you know, that the world will look at him and say, you know, we do renounce him and all his works. They will look at him, the world of U.S. politics will still look at him and say, okay, it was wildly over the top. He went too far in the following areas, but I can still draw the following things from him that worked, that I can replicate. I can take 30% of it. And if you're like me, and you believe that all of it is bad, like, I believe in a very conventional presidency. That's not a policy statement. That's just a statement about the institution. I don't want any erosion of the conventional presidency. I don't want any relaxation of norms, the norms that he has blown through. In fact, I want to strengthen them. I like 19th century American political rhetoric better than 20th century. You know, in the 19th century American politics, I only learned this recently. In 19th century, it was considered bad for U.S. presidents, unacceptable for U.S. presidents to talk about policy, except in formal statements to Congress. But when they made speeches, they weren't supposed to talk about policy. How wonderful is that? I want a normal, constrained, dignified presidency. So is it a blip? Maybe. Hope so. But I doubt very much it's going to be a blip that doesn't affect the way we conduct our politics. And by the way, if you look at the Democrats who are poised to run against him, they are all being affected by his style of engagement. They're all less attractive people than they would have been without Donald Trump.
Okay, I think we've got time for just one more question. Yourself?
You highlighted what looks like an inversion of the kind of normal conventional cliche, which is that presidents are very much domestically constrained, but get sort of free rein to do kind of what they like in foreign policy. And in this case, he seems to have a lot of free rein to do kind of what he wants on a political agenda domestically. But internationally, whilst he's been unconventional in his rhetoric and his attitude towards multilateral institutions and trade and allies, Congress is stepping in and doing things like sanctions and now talk about using the Magnitsky Act, sort of the Khashoggi incident. How does that change after the midterms, or if his legal troubles get worse, especially if you have a change in the party leadership in the houses?
Well, so first of all, I mean, the most dramatic example of this, and I think we almost certainly have you guys to thank for this, happened the other day. Probably didn't notice it over here. But, the president was poised to release a whole lot of information, highly sensitive FISA information, and under pressure from, quote, our allies, which I assume means howls of rage from London, backed off and didn't really, and actually said, in deference to our allies. So, to the extent that, one of the things that is constraining Donald Trump is allied expectations. And the compromise seems to be, say whatever crazy shit you want, and we won't consider it policy until there's some evidence that somebody is implementing some of it somewhere. And that seems to be the mode of engagement across a wide range of things. It's a disgraceful mode. It is not the way we should be. I mean, it's quite. It would be comical if it weren't not. But it does seem to be a mode of constraint that actually does work. There is a version of that that's happening domestically as well, which is the president says all kinds of crazy things, and members of Congress pretend not to have heard them. Like literally pretend not to have heard them. So that he'll tweet something and they'll go to Paul Ryan and say, Mr. Speaker, the president just said X, Y, and Z. What do you think? And he'll say, I didn't see the tweet. I don't read the tweets. I deal with what he does. And there are literally hundreds of examples of this. I think that your point that there are constraints that exist internationally that are the inverse of what we normally expect is an interesting one. I think the fundamental explanation for that is that the traditional American presidents, despite significant policy differences between them. It has been a long time since we've had a president who basically doesn't believe in the liberal international order, doesn't believe in the fundamental obligations of our alliance relationships, and those relationships are actually constraining. And so you don't experience the true magnitude of the web of obligations and treaties and organizations that we're part of until you don't seek to be until you seek to operate entirely outside of that. And one of the things that's genuinely radical about Donald Trump, and this is the first philosophical or ideological or statement I'm going to make, he represents a divergence, a departure from a very long U.S. consensus, a very long bipartisan consensus. And that consensus continues to operate around him, partly because he doesn't understand the things he's saying entirely. And so he can say something that sounds quite radical and he means very radically, and if everybody just interprets it in a much more narrow sense than he means it, then it goes away, at least for a while. And there's a certain amount of that that's happening on a day-to-day, week-in, week-out basis. How sustainable it is, I don't know. I don't think it's sustainable in the long term. If, again, those ties can bind the United States, tie down the United States for a while. Partly because Trump is as ineffective as he is, and as not committed as he is. He's the kind of person that if he wants to withdraw from a free trade deal and you literally steal the paper off of his desk, he will forget about it for a number of weeks until the next time you have to do that, right? And that's a particular kind of combination of fervor and dysfunction in which, it might be written on my tombstone someday, but early in the administration, I used the phrase malevolence tempered by incompetence to describe the travel ban order. And it has become a kind of all-purpose description of the behavior of the administration. It's a good explanation for this. In the long run, it doesn't work because the 7th or 8th time he remembers the letter. And that's when you really have a problem.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And thank you all for coming today and for some good questions. I remind you that please check our website regularly for other events. And I'll just say thank you again once more for our great speaker today. And we can just give him one more round of applause. Thank you.
Thank you very much.